We tend to visualize American history as a smooth, continuous climb, a straight line from muskets to the moon. But that narrative skips the decade where the entire country almost collapsed. Under the Articles of Confederation, the central government was effectively powerless. It had no authority to collect taxes, no way to pay its soldiers, and no ability to stop the 13 states from acting like 13 separate rival nations. By 1786, the system reached a breaking point. Unpaid war veterans in Massachusetts took up arms and marched on a federal armory in an uprising known as Shays' Rebellion. The fear of total anarchy forced the founders to gather in Philadelphia, scrap their original plan entirely, and draft the Constitution. This early crisis revealed the actual engine of the American experiment. History moves through a repeating cycle: boom, bust, and rebuild. Surviving as a nation meant accepting that collapse was inevitable. Success required using the wreckage to install a structural upgrade. This loop defined the mid-19th century. Rapid territorial expansion and the discovery of gold in California created a massive westward stampede as thousands of fortune seekers rushed to strike it rich. But every mile of new territory amplified a question the government could no longer dodge: whether these vast western lands would permit freedom or slavery. The political system eventually buckled under the weight of that division. 11 southern states seceded. Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter, and the country plunged into the Civil War. For 4 years, the nation tore itself apart. By the time the fighting stopped, over 620,000 Americans had been killed by their own countrymen on their own soil. Out of that carnage, the nation began a structural overhaul. Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, forcing the legal destruction of slavery and securing freedom for 4 million people. While the era of Reconstruction was tragically undermined by political deals, the war itself proved the country's capacity to pay an immense human price to rewrite its own foundational definition of freedom. The cycle accelerated in the early 20th century. The 1920s delivered a period of unprecedented wealth and industrial output, characterized by the rise of jazz, radios, and the first mass-produced cars. In October 1929, the stock market plummeted. Within weeks, life savings were wiped out, and the national economy ground to a near-total halt. The 1930s bust was a compounding catastrophe. 1 in 4 workers lost their jobs, thousands of banks failed, and extreme drought buried the Great Plains in dust storms that blotted out the sun. The response was a top-to-bottom reconstruction of the American economy. The government built a national safety net, poured resources into massive public works projects, and eventually converted idle car factories into the primary engine of wartime production. This rebuilt industrial base and mobilized workforce allowed the United States to deploy 16 million citizens to fight and win World War II. The nation entered the 1930s physically and financially broken. By the end of the 1940s, the strength of that recovery had positioned the country as the world's dominant superpower. By the mid-20th century, the cycle began to tighten, creating a period of societal whiplash. On the surface, the 1950s looked stable, defined by the growth of suburbs, new highways, and the first televisions in every living room. But the 1960s brought the internal contradictions back to the surface. The decade was defined by intense domestic protests and the assassinations of key leaders like John F. Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. During this period, the friction of violent societal division occurred simultaneously with a high-stakes technological race for the stars. In July 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon. It was an achievement reached using computers less powerful than a modern calculator, executed while the country was still deeply divided on the ground. The fact that the darkest valleys of unrest and the highest peak of human exploration occurred in the exact same decade proves that domestic conflict does not prevent the capacity for major breakthroughs. We see the same pattern in the modern era. The 1990s brought a period of massive economic growth as the internet transitioned from university basements into nearly every American home. That era ended on a Tuesday morning in 2001. The attacks of September 11th pulled the country into 2 long wars, followed shortly by the systemic financial collapse of 2008. The early 2020s brought a jarring halt to daily life as a global pandemic triggered lockdowns and deepened political fractures. Living inside a bust phase always feels like an existential end. That 250 years of history suggests that these periods are not the final chapter. They are the necessary friction that precedes a new direction. When you look past the volatility of the booms and the immediate panic of the busts, you find a recurring pattern of structural recovery. Crises are an inevitable part of the American timeline, but the defining trait of this experiment is a consistent historical willingness to take the damage, get back up, and rebuild.